All right, well, we got a lot to get through, so let's save time for Q&A at the end. It is terrific to be back in Chicago. I lived here for 12 years. I miss the Mexican food most of all, but you know, I think we have better baseball stadia here than we do in New York. I think we have better architecture. There are a lot of good New York things too, but we'll be partisan here and be pro-Chicago. But it's been a long year for me with the book coming out and the election and all this weird internet meme kind of thing going on. I'm not quite sure it's really like me actually that people are talking about, but some character who is based on me or something. But anyway, this is a presentation, by the way, or an example that I give in my book and that I've been giving for 4 years now, right? And it concerns what happened 4 years ago in 2008 on the television program, The McLaughlin Group, on the Saturday before the election. Now, we've just been through an election that, you know, we had a lot of debates about how close was it really, what's the probability that Romney might win. But 2008 was kind of a gimme, where Obama was up by 7 points in the national polls. He was up by 7 points in pretty much every swing state. Was not a hard election to call, you know, even based on the fundamentals. You had Bush with a 24% approval rating and the economy was going to hell, right? So you basically have to be, I've decided to stop being polite in kind of the war on punditry and the war on bullshit, right? You basically have to be a total fucking moron not to know that Obama's going to win the 2008 election, right? But what do these people who are paid for their expert opinions on TV say, right? They all say, oh, it's too close to call. It'll be decided this weekend. Only Eleanor Clift dares say Obama, Biden. Monica Crowley actually predicts McCain by half a point, right? The next week, by the way, she said it was inevitable that Obama was going to win because the economy was bad, all the common sense things that she should have been thinking about before. But this is not exactly like an outlying example. If you actually go through and score these predictions that they make, and they make them at the end of almost every show, so this is a painful exercise, but you know, in the spirit of science, I sorted through 4 years worth of bullshit at the end of every segment of the McLaughlin Group and saw how many predictions were right or wrong, and they all basically bat 500. Monica is a little bit worse than 500, and the Chicago guy, Clarence Page, a little bit better, right? But more or less around 500. And of course, so you have a similar thing happen this year, which is a more difficult election to call in a great number of ways. But by the end, I think whether because of some of the better economic reports over the past couple of months, or Hurricane Sandy, or just kind of Romney's debate bounce wearing off, you saw kind of the same thing on a much smaller scale than in 08, if you just kind of looked at the polls in the swing states. Obama was ahead in 80 or 85 or 90% of those polls. In most of the states, more than enough states, he needed to win the Electoral College. But you still have people having maps like, oops, shit, we missed a slide. But anyway, there's supposed to be a map here that has Dick Morris's predictions, where he had he had Obama winning, Romney winning Minnesota and Pennsylvania, and it was strange to me. Even people who deserve more respect than Dick Morris does, like Michael Barone or George F. Will, right? They said not just a Romney win. You could make the case that, hey, you know, the national polls show a tie, and if Obama loses Ohio, he's not in great shape, and Ohio's Republican-leaning, and blah, 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 right, and the incumbent rule, and so it's, you know, it's a little bit of a selective argument, but you can make a reasonable case that Romney might have a 50% chance or a 40% chance of eking a win out, right? Instead, they saw a total landslide. I thought this was a big kind of signifier, a big landmark, when you had people who are real conservative elites, right? I mean, Michael Barone and George F. Will are really smart dudes, right? But they're lost enough now that they expect a Romney landslide in contradiction to what all the polls said, what objective models built by political scientists would say. And again, truth is always an absolute defense. If you go out on a limb and say that Romney's going to win Minnesota, and he does, then you look like a genius. Maybe you got lucky, but it is a defense. But when you have an election that went basically as the polls said, in fact, you actually had Obama beat his polls by about 1.5 points in average on the swing states. So there was a bias in the polls, just not the ones all the pundits were complaining about, right? You had a pro-Republican skew in the polls. Maybe they were not getting enough minority voters, and so on and so forth, where the electorate, you know, doesn't necessarily look like it does 40 years ago, and people who are living in a bubble, and I don't want to be like too anti elitist here or whatever, or anti-elite. But the idea that Michael Barone or Dick Morris or someone who's going to these cocktail parties, these Georgetown cocktail parties, whatever else, right? That they have their finger on the pulse of America more than the polls do, where the polls actually go out and randomly call actual Americans, right? But those can't be trusted. Their gut instincts from the cocktail party can be. That's just totally delusional, and it's time to stop paying attention to these people and start getting real. But I do want to not just bash the pundits all that much. I mean, in the book we talk about how even people who are scientists, who are trying their best to work with difficult and tricky data situations, can make a lot of mistakes. And we haven't really developed, we have so much information now. I guess IBM says that 90% of the information in the world was created in the past 2 years. Does that mean that 90% of the knowledge in the world was created in the past 2 years? No, of course not, right? Maybe 9% was, or 0.09% or something like that, right? Which means in the terminology we use in the book, the signal-to-noise ratio is worsening, right? Basically, there's more bullshit relative to actual nuggets of real information that we're trying to detect. And so we need to develop better skills for how we sort through information. Sometimes our first instincts are not particularly good, where we're developed in an evolutionary way to perceive patterns and to react very quickly to new stimuluses. So for example, if you see, people do this all the time if you look at stock market charts. So these are a series of 6 quote-unquote stock market charts. 2 of them are actually real and reflect how the Dow Jones behaved over a period of, I think, 5 years, and 4 are totally fake, where you just flip a coin, you generate actually ones and zeros on the computer, and either you have a good day or a bad day in the market. But it's really hard to say which ones are real and which ones aren't. Some real investment gurus can perceive certain patterns here, but if you had a guess, then D and F are the real ones, FYI. But this also comes up in baseball, for example, where sometimes people have trouble with this idea of the average. So Bill James realized about 20 or 25 years ago that most Major League Baseball players follow a certain development curve, right? Where they start out when they're rookies, they're not usually all that good. And then when they're in their mid-20s, age 27, 28 or so, they get a lot better. And then they start to decline, especially if they're on the Cubs. But that's the average development pattern. In each case is idiosyncratic, where you have some guys who, Edgar Martinez, the Seattle Mariners, great, I think had his best offensive season at age 37. You have some guys who burn out early instead. So, this is a case where baseball data is relatively more straightforward. But we're fooled by all the noise of all these individual players and miss that there's a pretty consistent pattern here. And of course, what Bill James recognized is that in Major League Baseball, you basically own a player for the first 6 years once you draft him. He has 6 years of playing time for you. So usually a guy hits the major leagues at age 23, plays 6 years or so, he's 28, 29, then he becomes a free agent, and he's actually going to decline in all likelihood, but teams will pay him premium dollars. And so, this innovation alone was just very basic and very simple, but very important to the way that baseball teams were managed. Another baseball-related example to how our eyes can deceive us. So this is, if you're kind of a stat geek, you might know this example, otherwise maybe not. But Derek Jeter, certainly a terrific Hall of Fame shortstop, one of the best shortstops of all time. But he's not a particularly good defensive shortstop, it turns out, based on looking at the data. And this is a big source of controversy between kind of scouts and stat heads for many, many years. And what the scouts claimed, or maybe not the scouts, more like Major League broadcasters, right, is that Jeter always would make a lot of diving plays, right? He was always diving for every ball that he could try and get, right? But what they missed is that Derek Jeter was diving for plays that other shortstops would have made easily, that they didn't have to dive for. These guys are diving into like left field, right, into the pitcher's mound, and Jeter's just diving for everything because he has no real range, right? So not that complicated an argument. You can actually now measure and look at, we actually can have a 3D rendering almost of a baseball field and see how far people are going to make their plays when they're a shortstop. And Jeter, again, great offensive player, but his defense still kind of stinks. But you would not have that impression by looking at the visual of it. Sometimes we take for granted the things we do easily and give ourselves too much credit for the things that we make look hard when it should be easier potentially. By the way, that's true, by the way, about some of the selection stuff where, we did get 50 out of 50 states right, but so did several other websites, or you got 49 or 48 out of 50 right, and the 1 or 2, a lot of that is luck, right? So this is not like reinventing the wheel or rocket science, just that there's so much crap in political coverage that it seems like a revelation to people. But we do emphasize that it helps to think in terms of probabilities, right? So the ultimate example is we actually had Florida, we had Obama with a 50.1% chance of winning it, right? So basically a toss-up. So of course I'm happy to claim credit for it now, but it's almost literally a coin toss. But because people are not used to thinking in terms of odds and probabilities, then it's just very difficult to communicate that, frankly, to people. And this is a different example where in 2010, this is a forecast of the US House election, where we're looking at how many seats would Republicans gain overall. And note that we have like a really wide range, right? And so there we kind of thought, well, we would bet on the tails of the distribution here, right? And the reason being is that there were about 100 seats that were competitive that year because of the influence of super PACs. Republicans had a lot of organization early to get better candidates in the races, and so you had a much, much wider playing field, and that meant if you were off in the polls, if one side beat their polls consistently, they might win like way more House seats than the median forecast would predict. So we try and put a lot of emphasis on measuring how much we don't know, basically, right? And for most people, that's not what they're necessarily trained to do, and so it's difficult. But when we go on this election and say, oh, we think that Romney has only a 9% chance of winning, right? There's a method behind that, and we don't always say that kind of thing. And by the way, the 9% chances come up sometimes. In this election, we actually got this presidential race completely right, but we missed 2 Senate races, one of which was North Dakota, where we gave the Democrat Heidi Heitkamp only a 9% chance of winning, and she won. And that was the same chance we gave to Mitt Romney. So I'll be giving you a very different speech now, or you might be hearing Dick Morris instead, had we had that 9% come up in the presidential race. But fortunately, it was the North Dakota Senate race instead. But here's another case where this information can be difficult to communicate to the public sometimes. This concerns an example from weather forecasting. If you've read the book, you know that weather forecasters are kind of the heroes of the book in many ways. They did a great job, by the way, with Hurricane Sandy. More on that in a second. But they've also sometimes not always been as forthright with the public as they maybe should be. So this is a case from 1997. There was a lot of flooding, the potential for large flooding in Grand Forks, North Dakota. What happens is you have a big snowfall up in North Dakota, Manitoba, of course, because it's North Dakota and Manitoba. And then in the spring, that snow starts to melt, creates runoff, and the riverbanks rise potentially. So this year there have been a particularly heavy snow, and Grand Forks has levees that protect it up to 51 feet. And the Weather Service said, well, it's going to be pretty bad, but we think the waters will crest at 49 feet, right? So, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, what they didn't say is that the margin of error on their prediction was plus or minus 9 feet, right? So the flood actually grows to 53 feet. Not that bad, right? Only a few feet off. Well within the margin of error. But that wasn't very much help to the people of Grand Forks who lost 75% of their property in the disaster. So since then, the Weather Service has learned to communicate uncertainty, and they actually work with like behavioral scientists about how to display this information to people. So you might see kind of the cone of uncertainty or the cone of chaos, they sometimes call it, when a hurricane is about to hit. So 25 years ago, the best they could do 3 days in advance, you have a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, was to get within 350 miles. That's the average error, right? So half the time, you'll be between Houston and Tallahassee, and half the time you'll be somewhere in Mexico or, I don't know, or Cuba or something, right? Just no idea at all. And now they can get these predictions within 100 miles on average, and sometimes even better than that, even further ahead. So this Hurricane Sandy thing was really an amazing story science, right? And the reason why is that this was an unusual storm where it was a relatively benign hurricane, except for the fact that it was about to intersect this cold front in the Atlantic and then kind of careen off at a very unusual, almost due westward or west-northwesterly angle that is not very common for hurricanes, right? So if you have a model that's purely based on, say, past precedent, then you'd be fooled by that type of storm. But instead, the Weather Service actually have basically a physical simulation of kind of ideally every molecule in the atmosphere, but they simplify it with their little grid. So every little chunk of the atmosphere is simulated. They know what the real physical reactions are. And so they predicted correctly that how this unprecedented situation would occur. And they knew almost to the county where the storm would hit in New Jersey days in advance. Obviously, it doesn't prevent all the loss of life or all the damage to property, but people did have a lot of very precise and very accurate advance warning in that storm, and the weather forecasters really deserve a lot more credit than they get. And the funny thing is because weather forecasters go and say, well, you know, we're not sure, there's a 20% chance of rain, right? It frustrates people who are used to hearing Dick Morris or something confidently proclaim that, you know, Romney will win Minnesota, 100% guarantee, right? But they're the ones who really know what they're talking about. Oops. So this is another kind of example. This is kind of back to this nice parabolic shape. You might kind of remember earlier the aging curve for baseball players, or this could be the weather over the course of the year, say in Chicago, obviously colder in the winter months and warmer, higher data points in the summer. So in the pure world, right, or in the ideal world, you would have hundreds and hundreds of observations. Baseball is very much like this, actually, right, where there are about 750 players who play in the major leagues every year. Everything that's happened on a baseball field for the past 150 years has been recorded. It's a very, very, very data-rich environment where something like elections are not. And so instead of this, you kind of get this instead, where you get about, this is basically, we've had 17, I think, elections now since World War II. This is 17 data points or thereabouts, right? And so you're trying to figure out what the underlying true functional relationship looks like, but you don't have that many observations from which to do it. So since we got to play we got to play God earlier, and we saw what the real data looks like, and we can say, oh, it's just a nice parabola, right? We don't have to get too complicated here. It describes a basic, simple kind of mathematical function, right? But what instead happens is that people do this. This is called overfitting. They chase down the noise. They want to try and explain every past example, right? And what they don't realize is that they're no longer really doing prediction. They're just kind of, they're just fitting a stat software package that is describing history in a statistical way, right? People don't realize that it's not the same thing as predicting as just to have a model that describes historically what happened. In baseball, this might not matter as much. It's such a data-rich field that you can just kind of play with something in your software package and put out the results, and it will do a pretty good job of describing what will happen going forward. But in politics, it's a lot trickier. There used to be all these omens about how, for example, when the Washington Redskins won their last game before Election Day, right? It was supposed to be a good sign for the incumbent president, right? And this had been true, I think, for like 12 of the past 13 elections or something, and of course the Redskins lost. Redskins lost actually on Sunday, so that meant that the incumbent would be voted out of office, and Obama won instead, right? Which is not a surprise at all, but it just means that when you have so many possible signals, you're going to have a lot of false signals that people will mistake for real ones. So you do have to think about the structure of the problem. It's not as simple as just kind of plugging numbers into a model. So one other example of this, and maybe an example of kind of where there was some wishful thinking as well, is in advance of the terrible earthquake that we had in Japan last year. So it turns out that earthquakes follow a pretty regular empirical distribution over the long run, right? Over the long run is the important part here. But it's called the Gutenberg-Richter law, and what it says is that every point you go up in magnitude, you have 10 times fewer earthquakes. So that means for every 100 magnitude 6 earthquakes, you would have 10 magnitude 7s, 1 magnitude 8, 1 magnitude 9 every 10 years, and so on and so forth, right? So in Japan, the particular region of Japan where they had the earthquake in 2011, you had had a distribution like this, except you hadn't had very many earthquakes that were over magnitude 7.5 or so. And so scientists developed, or some seismologists in Japan developed all kinds of theories about why this was the case. It said, well, you have a different kind of seafloor here, and so the seafloor won't let you have a large earthquake, and so, I think, as you'll see, this turned out to be a very bad prediction of something that couldn't happen, right? But the Fukushima nuclear reactor was built to withstand a magnitude 8.6 earthquake that's as large as they could imagine one occurring, right? So instead of doing this nice, straight, linear fit, right, which would give you an answer that, yeah, actually you're going to have a magnitude 9 earthquake about once every 300 years or so not common by any means, but common enough that if you're building a reactor that's going to exist for a long time, you want to be able to withstand a slightly stronger earthquake. But instead, people are what we call overfitting, right, where they're using limited data to make too precise an analysis. And what the problem here actually is that the fact that you haven't had very many magnitude 8.0 earthquakes doesn't tell you very much because you're only supposed to have one once every 30 years or so. So this is 50 years worth of data. To not have a magnitude 8 earthquake once in a 50-year period is basically like a major league hitter, like a 300 hitter going 0 for 4 in one given game. It happens all the time. But people don't always have a good sense for how many tricks that randomness can play and how to really make their analysis richer by using theory, by looking at examples from other parts of the world. So the same mistake, by the way, they had made in Japan, where they said, oh, there are physical reasons why we can't have an earthquake this large. They had said the same things before the series of earthquakes in Sumatra that caused a tsunami there, I think 6 years ago it was. They said, oh, the seafloor is different here. You can't have that large in earthquakes. People were making generalizations about where you could have a magnitude 9.0 earthquake based on the fact that you'd only had 3 of them in recorded history, right? They're inherently rare events, and it's hard to learn very much about the regularities of rare events. By definition, they're rare events, so people have to be careful about these kinds of issues. So yeah, there's the magnitude 9.0, where this straight linear fit would say, yeah, you're going to have one of those every now and then, whereas the other one predicted much less chance of it. And one more example from the field of chess. So I'm not actually a chess guy. I like games where there's more randomness, like poker and backgammon. But if you're good at chess, you can see this position and maybe determine which player has an advantage. And this is a position from the first game of the 1997 match between Garry Kasparov, then the world champion, probably the best chess player in history, and IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. So there are kind of 2 ways to look at this position, and this gives us an indication of maybe how computers visualize and think about data, if you use the word think, and how humans do instead. So computers have heuristics. They have point values they assign to each chess piece. And there's some disagreement about, is a bishop worth 3.1 pawns or 3.0, right? But basically they're all in this general area, and you can kind of count up the pieces and say, well, I have more valuable pieces than he does. So Deep Blue might say, look, I have 30 points worth of material. Kasparov has 29, so I'm ahead. I'm probably going to win, not for sure, but if I play well, then I'll at least probably win the game. Whereas Kasparov looks at the same position, and he is able to see the bigger picture, right? So what he sees is that no matter how much material you have in chess, you lose if you're checkmated, if your king is vulnerable. And so he has all these pieces bearing down on Deep Blue's king, who is not very well protected at all. These pawns are going to threaten the king, or they might rank up to a queen. You have also pressure from the queen and the bishop, which can move diagonally across the board. So Kasparov knew this was actually a very, very strong position, not a weak one. And there's a little metaphor here for what we do when we look at data and use computers to do it too, that we have to provide judgment and theory in terms of how we set up these programs, right? You can't just plug in data and have it spit out results that are necessarily reliable. It's called garbage in, garbage out. What computers are useful for, though, potentially, is that, number one, they're very fast. They can sort through information and do rote calculations really, really quickly. And number two, if you design, whether it's a program or not, but if you design any set of consistent rules for analyzing information, then that can give you a leg up. There's something called Bayes' theorem that I discuss in the book, which is just a way to come up with probabilistic estimates of real-life events, but it gives you a set of rules for evaluating evidence, like you would have in a courtroom sort of, instead of making up precedent in an ad hoc kind of way. And that's the basic problem, again, with a lot of political analysis and a lot of analysis in other fields, is that, all of a sudden people decide, for example, the fact that the state polls suggested that Obama was ahead, national polls didn't. All of a sudden people decide, the national polls are the one true indicator, right? And they would not have been saying the same thing if the reverse had been true. Whereas what I do is I set up a series of rules that I thought were good in 2008, and then again in the spring, and you stick by those, and that at least avoids you kind of shifting with the wind every time, and sometimes you also find, by the way, that things don't change all that much. So we got 50 out of the 50 states right in November, but we actually had 49 of the 50 states right when we launched the forecast in June. Only Florida shifted because, look, it's not that complicated. We knew from the economy, basically, we do not have a recession. We also do not have a robust recovery. We have something in between. That would point toward a close election. We also know that the states basically vote the same way, more or less, every 4 years relative to one another. If they shift, they tend to shift in the same direction. So again, it's not really that complicated, but people get very, very distracted by information if they don't have good strategies for how to use it. There is, by the way, an irony, though, of this Kasparov story, which is later in the same game. Deep Blue, again, is playing black. It's under a lot of pressure here. And it makes a move that Kasparov found inexplicable, where instead of resolving one of the many threats it's under, it just moved its rook from the square known as d5 to the square known as d1. And Kasparov couldn't figure out why this was the case, and so eventually Kasparov inferred that if Kasparov, couldn't understand this move, it therefore indicated that Deep Blue had superior intelligence to him, because he was the best player in the world, right? So it meant that Deep Blue could therefore think 20 moves in advance and not just 15 moves in advance. It turned out, though, that I talked to Deep Blue's programmers, and it turned out this was just a random bug. What looked like a random error actually was a random error, where in chess you're on the clock, right? So the computer had a fail-safe where if some routine crashed, it would just make a random legal move, so it didn't run out of time. And that's what it did, and of course Kasparov took it for a sign of deep genius instead. And basically lost the match as a result. Kasparov was probably a little bit better than Deep Blue then. He wouldn't be now. The chess computers on your iPhone now are probably better than Kasparov was. But in 1997, probably not quite. But because of this kind of false signal he perceived, he started playing a very defensive style of chess. In the second game, he got intimidated and resigned a game that he maybe could have drawn. Played very defensively and therefore lost as a result, all because of a fortuitous or a serendipitous programming error on Deep Blue's behalf. But just to make sure that I'm not exempting myself, whoops. There we go. Exempting myself from any of this criticism. So I have a system I use to forecast baseball players called PECOTA. And so kind of 6 years ago, it was kind of the middle of the Moneyball battle still, right? So it's kind of scouts versus stats. And so for the first time in 2006, I generated an algorithmic list of top prospects, the top 100 prospects in baseball, just using pure stats alone. I said, well, let's kind of put this into a box, and after 6 years, we'll open it up and see which did better, the PECOTA list or the Baseball America list, which is based on the kind of the consensus views of scouts. And it turned out that actually the scouts beat the stats here. The scouts, the players the scouts had on their top 100 list produced about 100 more wins over the course of the last 6 years than the players on the PECOTA list alone did. So why is this occurring? Well, it's because the scouts are actually pretty smart, and now the scouts are very literate in what the numbers look like, so they can begin to add value on top of that. The value they add by knowing the things that you might make fun of if you're a stat head, but knowing like what the kid's work ethic is, for example, some of the physical tools he might have. If they're able to evaluate the information properly and give it some weight, not overweighted, not pretend that a guy who's hitting 200 is going to become a star, but then they can make progress. Whereas if you looked at the same Baseball America lists in 1990s or something, you'd have a lot of like Todd Van Poppel kind of disasters instead. But the scouts in baseball, for a variety of reasons, but partly because there are good incentives there. It's a very competitive field. You have 30 major league teams. It's pretty easy to evaluate whether you're successful or not. Do you win or do you lose? And yes, there is certainly a lot of luck in baseball, but you get to the long run quite a bit faster than you do in something like politics. So people can learn from their mistakes, basically. And this is a lot of what the theme of the book really boils down to, is knowing what we don't know. And this is one more example from Pearl Harbor, right? Where we had Hawaii. The irony is that before September 11th, we thought it was impossible to be attacked from airplanes coming from within the United States. We thought if there were such an attack, it would come from airlines abroad. But we made kind of the opposite mistake in Pearl Harbor, where we were worried about domestic terrorism, basically, domestic sabotage. There was some crazy theory that like the Japanese nationals who lived in Hawaii would attack like pineapple farms in Hawaii or something. It was really odd, right? But people settle on a hypothesis and maybe don't look for other potential threats. So in advance of the Pearl Harbor attack, which was as much of a surprise in its time as September 11th was many years later, we didn't really have the GPS kind of satellite proficiency that we have right now. Instead, we had 4 naval stations in the Pacific, where you have Dutch Harbor, Alaska, the Midway Islands, Wake Atoll, and Guam, right? So if you were trying to attack the United States, where would you go? Probably you would, like a receiver running a post route, go exactly where we're not looking, right? And so this surprise, where they had moved these 6 gigantic aircraft carriers, these are giant ships, it took them almost 2 weeks to go from Japan to Hawaii, moved totally unknown to us. And so, any type of intelligence analysis where you have asymmetrical threats requires, I think, a lot of humility about what you know and what you don't know. But more broadly, we are very smart creatures, but we're living in a very, very complicated universe, right? And I think sometimes we want simple answers to complicated questions. Sometimes we have to make approximations to get by in life, certainly with everyday things, but there's a trade-off for that. I think one of the problems you get in political coverage is that you have people who basically have a concept of objectivity, which is divorced from the concept of truth. And you can't divorce those two things. Objectivity means that there's something outside of my point of view. There's a greater truth that I will perceive imperfectly, but it is truth, right? Whereas in political journalism, objectivity means that you make each side equally angry at you. We should invent a new word for that, right? Maybe you can call it balance, which is, I think, a less important word, right, than objectivity is, right? But I think that's why I encounter a lot of resistance, is because I do have my own political views, but I'm trying to take a more scientific concept of objectivity. It doesn't mean that that judgment isn't required. It doesn't mean that I can't make mistakes. I certainly do. It doesn't mean I'm the only person you should listen to. But it's a different notion of how we're seeking answers, right? And it's not just a he said, she said. It's not just regurgitating spins that the campaigns say. It's at least trying to believe that there's an objective truth out there, and you're never going to get it perfectly, but you can chip away at it. And that probability is this transition point between ignorance and knowledge. And again, those attitudes I am realizing now are not very compatible with the political world, I don't think. But this is not purely a negative, ranty kind of message anymore. Where in the book we do talk about qualities that seem to correlate with more successful prediction. So there's a study by a psychologist named Phil Tetlock, who actually did this in a much more rigorous way than I did for the McLaughlin group earlier, where he surveyed expert opinion. An expert, in his definition, is just someone who is paid to opine about politics. So anyone from pundits to academics to people working in government. And he had them make predictions over a 20-year interval about all kinds of political events. Everything from would there be like a peso crisis in Mexico to will Quebec secede from Canada to who will be the next Supreme Court justice, and he had them give predictions in probabilistic terms. And he found that basically they were no better than random. Some people were worse than random. The people who went on TV the most often were actually worse. That was one of the best predictors of how bad your predictions would be, is are you on TV a lot? So I don't know what that says for me now that I'm getting more media exposure, right? But he also found that people who he called foxes, and the fox versus hedgehog thing comes from Isaiah Berlin essay where the hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many little things. And it's sexy to have this big theory, this kind of big idea that solves everything. But what Tetlock found is that if you are concerned about making predictions, then having this fox-like attitude is better. So you're multidisciplinary, you're adaptable, you're self-critical, you understand that the world's a complicated place. It doesn't mean your model needs to be, but what you can do sometimes is say, I have a simple model that provides a reasonably good representation of the real world, because the complex one might not get any better, because it's hard to do, but we understand there's error and uncertainty here, and being more aware of that. They tend to be very prudent. They're not as stubborn if something's not working as well, and they tend to be, empirically driven, where you're looking for evidence from the past, understanding that sometimes that will translate imperfectly into the future. And whereas in politics, again, you have more of these hedgehog types, where they want to believe, in one theory, no matter what. They're not willing to change their mind. They're not willing to say, I was wrong very often. Again, part of the biggest problem, if you go on these TV shows, then a lot of the time in real life and on TV, the best answer to a question is I don't know, right? It's often what you don't say, and this is something I realized kind of being in taking a lot of heat from people, right? It's sometimes when you don't respond to someone that you have more power, I think, right? That's what a lot of editorial control is saying, look, I think this is not something that should be promoted. It's basically a complicated way of saying don't feed the trolls, pretty much. But what you don't say is as important as what you do say. What you don't say means that people should respect more what you do say. And you pick your battles a little bit more because you know that there's some areas where you have more strength than others. But again, that's not the norm when you go on TV and you're supposed to opine on any topic at John McLaughlin's snap of the finger. So I think that's all I have for you today. But thank you very much, and we'll leave time for questions and answers.
May I? According to a highly reliable source, Saturday Night Live, the pollsters call only those with landlines, missing the kids with cell phones and the poor with no phones. Is that true?
So most of the better polls now do call people with cell phones. So CBS News, New York Times poll does, the NBC poll does. So it's more of a problem in polls at the state level that are trying to save money by not calling cell phones, and they don't do it. Although one funny thing, if you actually look at which polls did best on Tuesday night, it was polls that were conducted on the internet. Google is conducting polls now. People might not realize it, but there are 5 or 6 companies now that do online-based polling, and we're existing more and more in this virtual space. It's much more natural almost for someone to contact you online maybe than on your phone, especially on your landline. So we're going through kind of a paradigm shift now where in the future most polling might be done online, and fortunately those polls look like they were pretty good. But the polls that are done by telephone and don't call people's cell phones, it's becoming less and less acceptable, I think, where you're now basically disenfranchising a third of the American population from your poll, and the number's going up every year. So I think we might move to an equilibrium where you have some very high quality telephone polls like the NBC and New York Times poll and the Washington Post poll, but most of those polls, but otherwise you have a lot of internet-based polling, and you kind of cut out the polls in the middle. The cheapo robo-poll telephone polls, I think, are not something I would want to invest in, but internet polling did well on Tuesday and might be a part of where we're headed.
Using your mastery of the rich data of baseball and Bill James and PECOTA and all the algorithms that you use, what advice do you have for the management of the Chicago Cubs? And is there anything encouraging that you can say to those of us who are Cub fans?
Here's the most encouraging thing for the Cubs, right? Which is that might sound a little odd, but that they're not selling out anymore, right? It means finally the city has realized that you don't want to incentivize the Cubs to put a bad product on the field. You should boycott the Cubs when the team sucks, right? Go attend the games at Wrigley Field when the team is good, and then they'll have the same financial incentives that every other team does to build a winning ball club. But look, it takes some time to rebuild a team. If you try and do it in a hurry, it doesn't often work. So in baseball, these cycles can take 3 or 4 years to turn around. But sometimes you have to gotta take one step backward before you can move forward again as a baseball team.
So could you tell us that during in this presidential campaign, no McCain or no Romney had no chances actually to win elections? And second question, do you believe that Romney really listening to Dick Morris until last moment he believes that he will win because they linked some sides of congratulations with his victory?
For Dick Morris?
For Romney, they have some site where they declare victory actually by mistake in last moment. So what I'm asking, did he really believe to Dick Morris, who tell him that he's winning by 7 points or something?
Well, I'm not sure. That's one question. Is does Dick Morris really believe what he's saying, or is it all a game just to? And I'm not quite sure which is worse. I think it's better actually if Dick Morris actually believed what he was saying than if he just knew it was a total crock of shit, right? But I'm not sure, and that's why I did say, like, when you have like George Will and Michael Barone saying, really, really smart people, and Michael Barone knows every congressional district better than almost any other analyst, right? When he's saying he thinks it's going to be a Romney landslide, the polls be damned, and that really worries me for what's happening to the conservative movement in this country. And I'm one of those people who says, I'm basically left of center on most issues, some more than others, but I do think we need a healthy conservative movement in this country and a healthy Republican Party in this country, and that was a sign to me of ill health, right? That its leading lights, its leading intellectuals were so far divorced from reality, and for such thin reasons too. They weren't even really making an argument. They were just saying, well, we think that Romney will get a terrific turnout, and it didn't make a lot of sense. I think it was kind of sad to see.
My first question, did Romney had any chance to win in any moment of campaign?
Oh, did Romney? Well, sure. Look, there was a time when we had Romney's forecast going up and up and up and up every day after the Denver debate, and it wasn't clear then when it was going to stop, right? And he came very close. He came actually close enough where he pulled ahead in quite a few of the national polls, where he was within a point of Obama in Ohio. I don't think there was any one point in the campaign where if you held the election that day, Romney would have won the Electoral College. He would have had some days where he probably won the popular vote. But Romney's momentum kind of hit its peak. I think there was actually a signifier of this during the Republican convention when Romney, any convention is a big media show now. You get 4 days of free airtime, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he couldn't really persuade anyone that he had a stronger case. He kind of topped out at tying Obama in the polls, and lo and behold, he had a very good debate after Denver and made gains and kind of got stuck again at about 47% of the electorate, ironically enough. 48%.
How sophisticated do you think the people running the Obama and the Romney campaigns are compared to what you were doing on 538? So there were stories that the Obama campaigns had these terrifically accurate models at the end, and that the Romney campaign had some crazy model that was way off, and they thought they were going to win Pennsylvania. And I guess if you don't think that some of these people are all that sophisticated, why do you think that is? Because they're, unlike the McLaughlin group, they're paid to win rather than to be entertaining.
Yeah, so the Obama campaign is very good at this stuff, right? And the fact that they beat their polls in all the swing states, it could mean the polls were biased. It could just mean that they were using turnout models that were too restrictive, and you really were getting a lot of Democrats to the polls, and they're very, very smart to the point where other companies are looking toward them for leadership. It's not the Obama campaign emulating Facebook necessarily, although one of the guys who founded Facebook, used to work with the Obama campaign, right? So you have a lot of overlap there, but they really know their stuff. What surprised me though is that the Romney campaign didn't do a better job, and you're hearing accounts now from people who were volunteers working for the Romney campaign who said that their election day turnout program called Orca was a total disaster. It was buggy. People couldn't get through when there were errors. They didn't know, people didn't know basic information about that they needed like a credential to go be a poll observer and things like that, right? The phone systems were down. Just a lot of major mistakes. So I don't know. For some reason, John McCain in 2008 put almost no emphasis on his turnout operation, instead tried to win an air war. And it didn't work. McCain would have lost that campaign almost for sure anyway, given the economy and everything else. But it was surprising to me that Romney, being a guy who certainly knows how to run a business, certainly can be a data-driven guy himself. I don't like all his positions, but I think he's a very, very smart businessman, right? It surprised me that you would have that kind of error. When lo and behold, in 2000 and 2004, it was really Karl Rove and Bush that were pioneers of a lot of this voter targeting stuff, and they were well ahead of Democrats in many ways, especially in 2000. So in 2000, you had Al Gore win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. In 2008, Obama won both, but he was winning a lot of swing states by 4 or 5 points, right? Won the popular vote by 2.5. So he could have lost some margin in the popular vote and still probably won the Electoral College, and that would suggest that they're targeting voters effectively.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on sort of your level of interest in applying your techniques for activism. So, for example, it might be easier to, for a politician to get a referendum on the ballot for gay marriage if it could be conclusively established in the state that there's broad support for that. And you certainly have a lot of credibility at this point of being able to make those kinds of predictions. So it seems to me that might give you a kind of power in this way. I wonder if you have any level of interest in that.
Well, you do have a lot of options, and it's kind of, there are basically 3 things you can do, right? In terms of, or that if you're a lucky person like me that you have the chance to do, you can kind of, you can make money, right? Which there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think I pay my taxes, right? You can do things that are intellectually fulfilling and fun, and you can do things that are for the public good, right? And I hope that I'm able in life to kind of have a balance of those 3 things as much as possible. And look, I think there's a lot of room to use better data in the public sector, where one thing about the fields that I've covered, like politics and kind of baseball, less so now, but kind of in the pre-Moneyball era, is that it was an era, there were fields in which the bar was low, when there were inefficiencies kind of baked into the system because of bad incentives or blind adherence to tradition and whatever else. And I would think that there are a lot of inefficiencies in state and local government in particular. I know in New York that New York's collecting more and more information, everything from how schools are working to who's taking taxis where. And so, Bloomberg has become a more data-driven mayor, and they have a lot of information they're starting to sort through and not even sure what to do with it yet. But that's where I think you could see the next revolution is in making government a little bit more effective.
I do have a baseball question, but just real quickly, I wondered if you're following the hashtag Drunk Nate Silver madness of the last few days.
I'm aware of the hashtag, yes.
Very, very entertaining, but from a baseball perspective, I know that Bill James's Pythagorean theorem of wins projection is not your formula necessary, but I trust that you're familiar with it and follow that. So I'm wondering,
Sure.
This year's Baltimore Orioles team outperformed their projections by, I think it was historical margins. I mean, they were outscored badly over the year, and yet they won many more games than they lost. And I'm wondering if, does the Pythagorean theorem need some adjustment? Are you starting to see some things going on, more intricacies in the formula, or were they just simply one of the most lucky teams in the history of baseball?
I think they were one of the more lucky teams in the history of. I mean, it's not like if you saw the Orioles roster, you're not like, oh, that's a playoff team, right? It's kind of looked like a league average lineup, right? They looked like a team that was getting lucky, and they probably were. But if you have a really good bullpen, you can maybe beat the runs and if you basically perform better in high leverage situations, right? But we're talking about minor differences where the number of runs scored and runs allowed is a very reliable indicator over time. If you have a great bullpen or a terrible bullpen, you might have an extra game or 2 that you're supposed to win. But anything more than that is luck. I mean, the thing about baseball is the structure of baseball is pretty simple, right? So you can kind of say, no, this answer is right. In politics, you're never sure if your model of the world's totally right. You hope it's better or worse than someone else's. But in baseball, we can say, look, this is how the game works. It's got a simple structure, and when a team does what the Orioles does, then they basically got lucky.
Another thing you tracked during the election was the return on investment of each marginal dollar in swing states. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between campaign finance and politics? You know, is there some effect that money has that can be measured statistically? And is there some lessons to be drawn about the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of big money in politics?
Well, I think the first dollar is the most important dollar usually, right? I think at the end where Romney has super PAC money that allows him to run, the 87th ad in a state that the voter will see probably doesn't really make all that much of an impact. But for like a candidate for the U.S. House, when they're able to run a viable campaign instead of not being able to and able to run some advertisements, that probably helps a lot. So I don't know. I mean, the whole topic of what influence did super PACs have is a complicated one. One reason it's complicated is because that advertising spending doesn't actually equal total ad impressions, where if you run a campaign out of public funds, if you were to give money to the Obama campaign and he's spending out of that pool, then they're guaranteed the cheapest possible ad rates, right, by federal law. If you buy money ads through a super PAC, then it's a competitive market rate, which can sometimes be 3 or 4 times more expensive. So although the Romney campaign, plus its allies, its unaffiliated super PACs, spent a little bit more on advertising, not a lot more, but a little bit more than Obama did over the whole course of the campaign, he actually probably ran fewer ads because he didn't have that favorable treatment under federal law. So those nuances are things that we're just learning about now. But more to the point, I think you are encountering diminishing returns. So if the super PACs are smart, I think they'll more target congressional races and gubernatorial races and so forth in the future.
Is there a way of using the statistical modeling to demonstrate the influence of money in politics?
You can. I mean, people can run regression analysis where they look at, you run an ad in a certain market and how much does that move the polls there. You need a pretty rich data set to do that. But the general conventional wisdom in politics is that advertising does have an effect. I shouldn't say conventional wisdom, but the empirical research suggests that advertising does have an effect, but it's very, very short-lived, right? Maybe if you're kind of making an impulse buy, and that's why you had both campaigns try and running as much ads as they could at the very end of the campaign, although at that point you might be so burnt out that it doesn't really help all that much, right? So one interesting example is like when you're trying to promote a book, right? You're supposed to actually do less media. This is too much inside baseball talk. I apologize in advance, right? But they want you to do less media in the run-up to the book so you kind of burst on to the scene, right? And you're fresh and new until you get overexposed and you go back into hiding again, right? But I wonder if you'll have a campaign, maybe at some point pursue that strategy. Say, we're not going to advertise until October, right? And then we're going to save everything for the end and have momentum at the right time. I don't know if anyone will be willing to risk their whole campaign on an interesting political science experiment, but it might be worth trying.
Yeah. Nate, yesterday you wrote about what seems to be a structural advantage for the Democrats going forward through the next couple of election cycles in the presidential race. Are you going to be looking at the House race, and is it possible that conversely the Republicans have a structural advantage going forward, at least until the next redistricting?
Well, I think if you count up all the popular vote for the U.S. House, right? Who voted for which House candidates? The Democrats actually, I think, won the popular vote for the House by about 1 percentage point, not by a lot, right? But they have many fewer seats, and that's because the way, when you divide things into districts, the Democrats are all here in Chicago or in New York, right? In big concentrated areas. And so the fact that you have the Democrat win these districts by 40 percentage points is not so helpful to them. And plus the fact that you have redistricting. If you're going to have a good year, the Republicans picked a really, really great time to have a good year in 2010. They'd also do very well in state and local elections, so they control the redistricting process in many, many states. And as a result, they locked in gains that will benefit them for the next 4 election cycles after this one. So it's going to be hard. You'd really have to have a Democratic wave, not just a pretty good Democratic year, Democratic wave, I think, for Republicans to lose the House, and that probably is baked into the cake, because they try and bake it into the cake based on the way they draw the lines in the districts.
Can you tell us what would happen if you applied your model to climate change and the financial markets?
Well, those are topics we discuss in the book, and they're some of the most complicated topics, I think, that in the field of prediction in general. I do think it's important to emphasize that look, there's not one universal model that solves, that solves everything, right? You have to understand a problem and understand that in climate change, for example, it's a very, very complex system on the one hand. On the other hand, we have very strong theoretical knowledge about the climate, right? Basically, the greenhouse effect has been understood for 150 years, and that's just the basic idea that if you put more carbon into the atmosphere, then we reflect more heat back onto the Earth's surface, and so it warms the planet, right? And that's the reason why the climate models are trustworthy, not the kind of computer modeling parts of it per se. It's hard to say all that specifically what will happen apart from the planet getting warmer. But so, you know, and finance is something where I know a lot of smart people have met their death knell in finance, trying to beat financial markets. It's very tricky. So like I said, I prefer fields where the water level is low, where things are not being, not being done very well for a variety of reasons, right? And then you can look really smart just by being pretty good, right? It's easier.
Hello. Can you tell us what computer tools you use for organizing, modeling, visualizing data?
Yeah, so I mostly use Stata, is where I do my back-end stuff, but I can make nice-looking graphs in Excel, right? If Excel were like an Olympic sport, I'd represent the United States, I think, probably. But I should also say that the New York Times graphic team does a lot of really, really terrific stuff, and I think the visual component of this is super important, and the communication of it is super important. We understand things a lot better visually sometimes than we do when you have big, long chunks of text, right? And so, in some ways, I think that's one of the reasons that 538's been successful is because I do pay attention to the prose and how we're presenting material, right? And that I work with who I think are the absolute best people in the data visualization business at the New York Times. And so it looks attractive, and so people who learn in different ways can find the material more approachable and accessible. Thanks. Thank you.